Cricket and netball are the latest sports to be given the green light to host international tours and tests in New Zealand. It was confirmed today that the West Indies and Pakistan cricket teams will tour New Zealand this summer, with the Silver Ferns to host England in a 3-test series starting next month. It comes after the Wallabies were given the all-clear to play 2 tests in Wellington and Auckland against the All Blacks. They touch down later tonight to begin their managed isolation. Sports Minister Grant Robertson says other sporting codes are also able to make their case for bringing touring teams here, with safety provisions paramount. I spoke to Grant Robertson a short time ago and asked whether the government had become involved in efforts to keep the All Blacks out of isolation over Christmas.
We're continuing to work with New Zealand Rugby. Clearly our view is that we should have a rugby championship that sticks to the original dates that were agreed between New Zealand Rugby and Rugby Australia, but that's primarily a matter for them to sort out.
So are those discussions you are privy to on a kind of day-to-day level, or are you leaving it to the sporting bodies themselves?
Oh, no, very much leaving it to the sporting bodies to do the work, but clearly, we have a good relationship with New Zealand Rugby, and we've worked closely with them to facilitate the Bledisloe Cup games taking place and to support them in participating in the Rugby Championship. But the day-to-day work on that is the responsibility of the various sporting bodies in these different situations.
So no formal requests as of yet that would mean the All Blacks can spend Christmas with their families?
Look, obviously that's what we all want, is for the All Blacks to be able to spend Christmas with their families. Clearly we also have consistent rules around managed isolation and quarantine. So, we'll work through this. There's a bit of time between now and when the games are played, but we're just going to support New Zealand Rugby the best we can.
Would you be open to making any changes if that request was made?
Look, that's not something we're looking at the moment. We've been very consistent about the fact that 14 days isolation is required by everybody who comes back into New Zealand. That was facilitated via the original timetable for the Rugby Championship, and people could be back, the rugby players could be back off home with their families. So, let's see how discussions go over the next few weeks.
So the Wallabies arriving here tonight, can we confirm the conditions of their managed isolation? Are they going through the same process that all returning Kiwis are?
They are. What we have been able to do, as has been previously announced, is facilitate, with advice from the Ministry of Health, the ability for the team to train. So everybody in the team comes in, they have to have a day 3 test. If that day 3 test comes back negative for the whole team, that then allows the team to begin training, but they stay within their bubble and they stay in the managed isolation facility right through to the end of their 14 days.
And that managed isolation facility, that has the same personnel and protocols that all returning Kiwis are going through?
Absolutely. It is in fact one of our existing isolation facilities.
And so with this further boost with these teams that have been announced today and other codes and things, those same conditions will apply for them as well?
That's right. I mean, we've been working closely with the codes and the Ministry of Health on making sure that teams can train and do what they need to do to be ready to play, but at the same time they're within our managed isolation program. We've got all the protocols, all the health staff, all the health checks, everything that you would expect from anybody who's in there. Really the only difference here is the facilitation of training, which is obviously important for athletes who we expect to be able to perform at a high level fairly soon after they leave from isolation.
So with these other codes, does that mean that everyone is going to go to the same part of the country or somewhere it's easy for all of those trainings to take place? Is everyone going to go to Christchurch, for example?
Those final details are still being worked through with our managed isolation team, but clearly we're able to use that facility for the Wallabies, and there's an ability to use a secure training facility as well. Each sport has slightly different needs, and so they're just being finalised at the moment, but all of them will be going through the same kind of secure, safe facilities that we currently use.
Who's footing the bill for all of these sports teams coming out here through those MIQ?
So the teams are paying, and I think that's what everybody would expect, actually. And obviously, we've been able to work out a cost that is covers, the costs of those their time in managed isolation. That's similar to what happens for business people who are coming back for particular roles as well, or coming in for particular roles. So, that's been worked through with the codes. Clearly, these games represent a fantastic opportunity for New Zealanders to see quality sport, but they're also economic development opportunities for the cities and places where the games are played. So there's a good return on this, but we do expect the teams to be paying their way.
How much are they paying?
So it's a figure of around $7,000 per person. That is the full cost. You'll recall that we had a figure of around $3,000 that we're charging returning New Zealanders. That was only ever a contribution to costs. So we've worked that figure out with the teams that we believe that to be a reasonable figure that will cover the costs of their stay.
And you say that it's about economic development in part. Are the teams that are coming out here being chosen and the green light being given based on how much cash they're likely to inject into the economy?
No, not particularly. I mean, all international sporting teams coming to New Zealand playing games will have that effect, but this is something that the sports themselves have worked out. Obviously, in the case of cricket, you've got teams who were scheduled to travel here in terms of the West Indies and Pakistan. When it comes to netball, they've organised and negotiated that with England, who are in a position to come here, but that's very much been the decision of those sporting bodies. We haven't been dictating that in any way.
What happens if one of these players does test positive?
Well, sadly, then, in the case of most of these things, that would probably mean the end of the tour or the tournament, because the clock would start again for the teams, and that would probably end up meaning that the games wouldn't be able to be played. And that's actually the risk that obviously the sports themselves are carrying. In order to be able to train as a group, they're taking the risk that if one of them gets sick, that effectively means the whole team has to stand down. If there were other arrangements where we had smaller bubbles, then perhaps you'd be able to manage that a bit differently. But that's where the sports have landed. Our Ministry of Health has said, well, we can manage the public health risk that way, but clearly if someone tests positive, then the clock restarts, and that may well mean we won't see those teams actually play.
If the All Blacks go to Australia and someone from Argentina tests positive as part of that tournament, is the whole thing off?
Well, again, that's totally a matter for SANZAAR and the Australian Rugby Union, who are the organisers of it. With our system, the system that we've got here, obviously people train in their bubbles and they're not able to get out of isolation until they have tested positive. So from our perspective, we've got a very clear process for that. You'd have to be talking to Rugby Australia and SANZAAR about how they would manage that if that occurred in the Rugby Championship.
In terms of the teams coming out here and that $7,000 figure, is it being factored in the health costs if one of those teams was to test positive and they have to be tied up in our health system?
Well, clearly that the costs are the costs of managed isolation and working through that. I would suspect that there would obviously be the teams themselves would come to arrangements around whether they stayed or whether they actually left, and whether some people stayed if they did test positive. But we factored in the costs of managing this, and that includes the health staff.
The economic benefits of these teams coming out here, I presume some of it is based on large crowds turning out to some of these games. As we kind of yo-yo in and out of levels, are you concerned that a lot of those games may not end up eventuating?
Oh, and I'm pretty confident we will be able to have crowds there. We're obviously in level 1 now. The teams and the sports have had to factor that in themselves, because they obviously, in many cases, are the ones who'll benefit from gate takings and so on, as well as those spillover economic benefits. And, there's been a bit of talk about the Bledisloe Cup games, that if Auckland was still at level 2, the Auckland game might get moved to somewhere that was at level 1. So I imagine all the sports are talking about that. But, we're going well as a country here, and as long as everybody keeps obeying the rules and keeps fulfilling what they need to do, we'll be able to stay at level 1 and have good crowds at the games.
And the Ranfurly Shield this weekend?
As a person who grew up down in Dunedin, I'm always keen to see Otago do well.